Label Writing and Audience Engagement webinar with the American Alliance of Museums. I'm Adam Lafacci, your host from Learning Times. We are the proud sponsors and producers of today's webinar. And now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to our moderators for today. And we'll start by turning it over to Greg Stevens.
Thanks very much, Adam, and thank you all for joining us today. I see that we have a very big crowd of our colleagues from all different types of institutions and different roles within the museum. So we're very excited to have you join us, and I'm very excited to have my colleague James Burns joining me as a moderator for today's program. James, welcome.
Thank you, Greg, and I'd just like to say a few words about the Excellence in Exhibition Label Writing Competition, which is sponsored by AAM Curator Committee in cooperation with EdCom and NAME, and in partnership with the Museology Graduate Program at the University of Washington in Seattle. And by highlighting the remarkable work of label writers and editors, the competition, which was founded in 2008, seeks to champion high-quality label writing and to inspire museum professionals to produce their very best work. So each year, selected exhibit labels are featured at the Marketplace of Ideas during the AAM annual meeting and in the competition's online archive. And our goal with the competition is to serve as a resource for museum professionals striving to write excellent label copy. So each year, jurors representing CurCom, EdCom, NAME, as well as previous honorees volunteer their time and expertise to review and select the winning entries, and then the previous year's winning entries are accessible on the competition's online archive on the CurCom page on the AAM website. And I do need to give thanks to my colleague John Russick, Vice President for Interpretation and Education at the Chicago History Museum, who's organized the competition every year since 2008. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, James. And while I've got you on the stage, I wonder if you might tell our colleagues just a couple of words about the work that CurCom does, what you all are about.
Well, in addition to the label writing competition, we also have an Excellence in Exhibition competition, and we are very active in soliciting sessions for the annual meeting as well. And then this is our second webinar, and judging by the response today, I think we'll probably be doing another one.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James. And it's my pleasure now to take a moment to very briefly introduce our presenters for today's program. I'm very excited to have our colleague Shirley Hudson-Hill, Sarah Bartlett, Susan Day, and Kat Talley-Jones on board with us, each of whom will share a little bit of their experience and specific projects related to label writing, and you'll be hearing from each of them as we go through our program. I'm also very pleased to welcome as our special guests our colleagues Benjamin Filene and Jenny Sayer-Ramberg, who are here to provide their perspective and their on-the-ground views about exhibition label writing and audience engagement. So Benjamin and Jenny Sayer, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And of course, today's program is all about exhibition label writing and audience engagement. And in today's webinar, we'll be exploring various approaches for including audience voices in the label writing process and exploring ways that you can tell intriguing stories that can help your audiences make connections as part of their museum experience. And hopefully, after participating in this program, you all will be better able to assess your own exhibition labels for effectiveness with regards to audience engagement, and be able to recognize a variety of label writing styles that may fit your specific exhibition needs, and hopefully engage in a thoughtful exhibition label writing process, assuming that you already all do, but hopefully this will give you some new ways of thinking about the process of label writing. And with that in mind, we would like to start off our program by asking all of you in the audience for your opinion about what makes a good label. And you can respond into the general chat box in the lower left-hand side of your screen. And we'll take a moment to see what you all have to say. And and I'll invite my presenters and special guests and moderators to comment as you see things coming in. I see a lot of short, concise.
It's a lot moving fast.
Yeah, a lot of easy to reads there as well, which I totally concur with.
Punchy.
Questions.
Accessible. Informative, compelling.
Sparking curiosity. Those are all great.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, a hook. Yeah, that's good. Relevance. Leads visitors to think. No, these are all great. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, some very interesting comments. So
I particularly love active voice.
Oh, yeah. Excellent. Well, folks, keep your comments coming in, and throughout the program, we encourage you to continue providing thoughtful commentary or asking questions. And you may have some resources of your own that you want to share, perhaps a web link or such that you can share with all of us in the audience. So feel free to keep that chat going. And with that in mind, we're going to start our formal part of our program with our first presentation on writing engaging exhibition text at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And Shirley Hudson-Hill is here with us. Shirley, I'm so glad you joined us for today's program, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say on this topic.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, and hello, everyone. It's certainly my pleasure to be speaking with you today. I'm going to be speaking about writing engaging exhibition texts. And even though this webinar is called Exhibition Label Writing, I see labels as part of planning for an overall strategy for many layers of exhibition text. And because I work in an art museum, in fact, texts are the main ways, the central ways in which we communicate with our museum visitors. So they are so key in most of our exhibitions. We do think here at the AGO of exhibition text as layers. So just going through a few of the layers here, you have things like title walls, large vinyl quotations that hover above the artworks. You have section and interpretive panels, so text that refer to a thematic room or a group of works or objects. We call artwork or object-specific labels extended labels here at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I just couldn't resist including a slide of visitor-generated texts, which are really important to us here at the AGO as well. I wanted to just launch, and here is also just a diagram representing, we often use the metaphor of the onion to think about exhibition experiences, texts, and other strategies. And here you can think of how visitors are moving through and going deeper, peeling back those layers and going deeper and deeper into the materials. Just launching our conversation today with a few text writing tips, some basic overall exhibition text writing tips. Here at the AGO, we aim in each of our texts, whether it's an interpretive panel, summary text, or extended labels, to be around 100 words. Sometimes even we can hit about 80, which is really a sweet spot. And our visitors say that that is just enough in the visitor research that we've done on our labels. We keep our tone friendly, conversational, informal. Now, that's not to say we dumb it down for our visitors, but I like to, use that story of maybe you can imagine your old friend from high school who's now an electrical engineer or a doctor coming to visit your museum. Or maybe it's your keen 17-year-old niece. How would you speak to these friends and relatives about this particular artwork or object? We encourage everyone in our text writing to stay, to be direct and to stay focused. In 100 words, you can only really cover one angle or one idea, maybe two if they're interrelated. And we also try to put our most important ideas first in the labels. And you can really work on that, I guess, during your editing process, because you can write something, and I often tell my students that sometimes that grand last statement becomes your first, that great summary nugget that you have becomes the first sentence of your label. We also try to treat each text separately here at the AGO. So if you define something on one label, it's okay to repeat that definition on another, because we never know how visitors will encounter text and whether they will read every label. It's not a holistic story. It's not like sitting down and reading them and reviewing them like we do at our desks. We also try to avoid the passive voice and jargon as much as possible. And the content, some of us have control over the content, some of us don't. So sometimes you just have to work with what you have. But content, will it grab the reader's attention? Will it evoke humor and pathos? Will it transport them to another time and place, encourage them to look closely at the artwork or the object, and inspire discussion? Those are some of the things we're thinking about with the content of our labels. And I also just wanted quickly to point out that there's this great app, the Hemingway app, and I don't know if you know about that already, but it highlights, you can plug your text literally right into that, copy and paste them, and it highlights hard to read sentences, adverbs, passive voice, and it's just a really useful tool in the writing and editing process. The exhibition that I'm going to focus on today is Jean-Michel Basquiat, Now's the Time, which was an exhibition we organized, and it ran here at the AGO from February until May, just earlier this year. And it was surcharged and in our large 10,000 square foot exhibition space. And this show was there was a real special opportunity for the team here on this show, because our mandate from our leadership team was contemporary relevance and community engagement, which are really exciting words for an interpretive planner to hear. And in terms of Basquiat, voice was so important to us. And so our approach with our exhibition text was all about layering of voices. And we had a point of view by sharing different points of view on Basquiat. Basquiat deals in his work with all sorts of issues that are so relevant today. So everything from, deeply entrenched racism to personal identity, power, inequality. So we wanted to tackle these issues head on in our texts. And we did this by providing a space for the artist's voice, Basquiat's friends, Basquiat experts, people who inspired Basquiat, and we did this in those layers that I was talking about. So here's an image of one of our thematic sections, and you can see and a patron reading it. And I didn't have a very good image of this one, a photograph, but this was one of my favorite texts in the show. It was in the section that was the thematic section around racism, and we called it Reclaiming Histories, and we had rated in the top of that summary text a quote by Bell Hooks: "To see and understand these paintings, one must be willing to accept the tragic dimensions of Black life." And then we really brought it home. So much was happening in the U.S. and in Canada while we were planning this show. So the first sentence of this text is, "Like the signs recently carried by protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, and across North America, Basquiat's works insist that Black lives matter." So we were very direct and very focused in framing this in a contemporary way, the works that people were seeing. This work that you see in this image was a particularly poignant work at the heart of the show called "The Death of Michael Stewart," and it's disturbingly relevant because this is a picture. This is an homage to Basquiat's friend who died by he was beaten to death by police, and it's such a moving and sensitive issue. We chose to highlight on our extended label for this piece the story of Michael Stewart, so what happened, but also a poem, an excerpt from a poem by this great Minnesota poet, Dinez Smith. I encourage you to look up the full text and all of Dinez's works, but here's a key line. I demand a war to bring the dead boy back, no matter what his name is this time. So it was a particularly moving moment in the show. We also, one of the mandates of the show was to make connections using our text with Torontonians, because this was a 1980s New York artist. So how is that relevant to Torontonians? So we decided to do, our local audience. So we decided to do community voice labels. And you can see one here next to the artwork, and I'll go in close to another example here. So we invited all sorts of people to write their own labels for these works. They featured local academics, artists, but also voices that represented the wide swath of our visitors. So we had a local musician, an activist, a dentist, a healthcare administrator. Here we have the wonderful Julie Crooks, who's a curator at our neighboring institution, the Royal Ontario Museum. And then in this other example, we have Casey Messia, who is sharing her perspective on a work, and she's a local artist and musician, and was part of a very popular Toronto band called Aubergine. So we were very excited that she said yes. Here you can see we placed the labels as closely as we could to works. When we were doing the dress rehearsal for this, I talked about negotiating placement, and here I always prefer labels to be as close to the work as possible. The curator for the show wanted a clean wall for this particular untitled self-portrait by Basquiat, and so we had a discussion about that label placement, but it's still great to have that community label there. Our research, we did research specifically around these community voice labels, and we found, we talked to over 200 people, and 60% of those interviewed had positive things to say about these community voice labels, but also a significant chunk of people, it was very interesting how they thought they were too subjective. And it's interesting, we had some amazing academics and experts on these works providing community voice labels, and even their perspectives were considered subjective. So people were looking for that institutional AGO type label, which was very interesting. And we're going to try this again in an upcoming exhibition. And I think what we'll do is actually have an institutional label and then a community voice label next to it, so people don't feel like they're so that the group of people who feel they are subjective still can be satisfied with another label. Just some things that people said. They said they were resonant. That's my life. That it fit with the Jean-Michel Basquiat way of looking at the world, but other people thought the artist's voice would have been more relevant. And again, it was too impressionistic and too subjective. I just wanted to also say, Basquiat was a very special exhibition here at the AGO. But there are day-to-day realities of working with your collection and in your permanent collection galleries that we deal with those issues all the time here at the AGO. I just wanted to mention that I often cite in my team meetings the holy trinity of exhibition tech success, because I find that to be content design and placement, and placement includes lighting. So we spend a lot of time here on the content and making sure that content is, we write it, curators, interpretive planners working together, and then it goes through all sorts of approvals and editing. But then sometimes, is the design readable? So is it high contrast, and is it placed where someone will find it? So yeah, you do sometimes be cognizant of all those things when thinking about labels, and then also the content. Sometimes, like I said, you can develop. You have control over the content you develop. Sometimes you just have to work with what you have. And I just, in conclusion, I wanted to encourage everyone to don't be afraid to make small and gradual changes, because those small changes will have big impacts over time. So maybe it's deciding, okay, maybe I'm going to try just keeping my labels to 100 words and not using the passive voice, and see where those two things get me. And I also encourage you to experiment and spend time, if you can, even if it's just talking to 5 or 6 visitors, testing your labels and seeing what visitors are doing and observing how they're interacting with your text in your spaces, because everyone's visitors are slightly different. So that is everything for me, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow.
Great. Thanks so much, Shirley. And there's quite a few questions that have come in, and we'll start addressing those in just a moment. But I want to invite our special guests, Benjamin and Jenny Sayer, to share any thoughts that you might have about what Shirley presented.
Thanks. This is Benjamin Filene from UNC Greensboro. I was one of the judges on the exhibition label competition, and I agree with what Shirley is saying, that the idea of having best practices or rules in mind as you begin this work is very useful. But what was interesting is that a lot of the labels that we recognized broke those rules. And so I think to have those set up, your best practices in mind, and then to think about when and why you break them is a lot easier to break them if you have a purpose in mind. I think your idea of imagining a reader, a particular reader or a profile, even if it's a range of readers, is a good way to go about that. That can help you set the rules for the project at hand. I think often we think about audience more concretely when we're doing floor plans and design, but somehow when it comes to label writing, we sometimes set that aside and instead have an allegiance to more like to a body of content. You know, I have to cover this. I have to get this in here somehow. And not, if we're imagining any audience, it's as if we're imagining a hostile scholar who's going to read this and pick it apart, which I think is a pretty unhealthy way of writing. It leads to a lot of bogged down labels. So if we do, as you suggest, imagine who are the different people coming to this, what would their needs and interests be, then it's easier to set rules that are audience-driven, the way we want the rest of our exhibit to be.
Well, and I do like the word best practices more than rules, because, I mean, I don't know if anyone's paying close attention during my presentation, but we definitely broke the 100-word mark on several of our extended labels in Basquiat, because we had these thick, juicy, wonderfully relevant quotes that we just thought were so important. But, we did also have some labels that were 50 words and 60 words, so we did mix it up. We're not writing for experts, and something I often say to my team members here in terms of jargon, and in the art world it's often isms. But, for example, if you want to write on a label that this work is a fantastic example of fauvism, showing, the influences of modernism, but still a key influence on impressionism, or something like this. Anyway, people who know about those things actually already know that, so you don't need to tell them that on a label, the people that understand those terms. And so you're better off using your space, your 100 words, for something else. Greg, should I start tackling some of the questions that have come up about, or what do you think?
This is Jenny Sayer. I'll just make a quick comment. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this example and the use of different voices is how it seems from your story about it that it's really rooted in the basic story you're trying to tell through this exhibition about the artist's voice, and what impact that's had, and that guided your choice to include different voices. And I just think the piece of us understanding when is it appropriate or when does it help, what job does it do to bring in other voices, that seemed really clear that was part of your intent.
Yes, and I mean, Baskia's story, it was his story, and the team felt very strongly, too, that there wasn't so much diversity on the planning team itself, and we had really important and serious questions about who are we to tell this story, and that was the driving force behind seeking other voices to include in this show. We also, I saw a question go by, but we had a community advisory group that we turned to all throughout the exhibition planning process, mostly people from the local African diaspora community, and they were instrumental, and many of them ended up being voices on. We also had a multi-perspective audio tour, and that complemented the community voice label strategy, but they were voices on the labels and on our audio tour. And then otherwise, we just turned to, we as a team spent a lot of time during the planning speaking to all sorts of different people out there in the world about Basquiat. So we found basically Basquiat superfans out there. And so it was through informal conversations that we actually found people to do the community voice labels for us that ended up doing them.
Shirley, thanks a lot. I wanted to address a couple of questions that came in from our audience, some of them theoretical and some of them practical. On the practical side, questions related to font size. How do you go about determining font size for the various types of labels?
It's funny that we asked that. I literally had a meeting at 9 o'clock this morning about that. We're updating our label standards. Over the past 8 years, we've been increasing our font size, and we have a new method of producing labels. They're painted vinyl, so we exactly match the paint color of the wall. That allows us to do a much larger font size. The font size varies depending on the actual font itself, because some fonts have to be bigger, but our labels are increasing in size every year. And it also depends on the size of the work. In Basquiat, we were lucky because the works are very large scale, so we could have very large scale labels. But it's something that we discuss a lot of. We discuss often here at the AGO, bumping up that font size. A lot of our visitors and a lot of our members, who are our key supporters, are people over 50 who wear glasses. And label placement also becomes important, because you never want to have visitors stooping to have to read a label and that sort of thing.
Great, thanks. And I know we're going to move on to our next presentation, but I want to close with you just briefly by asking how you go about evaluating visitor response to these the community-focused labels. What is it you know, and how do you know?
Yeah, we for these large surcharge exhibitions, we do large summative evaluation projects that include a variety of qualitative and quantitative methods. But a lot of the responses that I shared today would have been from visitor interviews, but also we know from tracking and visitor observation.
Great, thank you. And of course, there's many, many questions that have come in that I know our audience would welcome your responses in the chat box. So I appreciate you taking a few moments to do that. And we'll go ahead and thanks, Shirley. We'll go ahead and move on to our next presentation, which is Writing Beyond the Facts, the Porch Band Indians Museum. And Sarah Bartley, you're here to talk to us about that project.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's been really interesting so far, and I think what I have to say sort of builds on what Shirley has talked about with community engagement. We've all seen Native exhibits about Native culture that falls into one of these two traps of either being too focused on the past and treating these living cultures as long dead relics, or taking the opposite tactic and romanticizing and rhapsodizing about Indians like they're some sort of magical curiosity instead of actual people. And both approaches, I think, sort of have the same result of holding Native cultures and people at a real arm's length and it's sort of keeping the audience from engaging with them on a personal level. So when I was brought on as a contract developer and interpretive writer for the Porch Band of Creek Indians Museum in Alabama, we were determined to take a different approach. The main audience for this exhibit is tribal members and their families, and a lot of the tribal members really didn't know very much about their larger history. They talked about, their family history, but they really didn't know about the Creek history and sort of, a lot of their larger context history. The museum also gets a lot of visitors who are just having a general interest in Native culture. These people really come from all over the world, and for them, a lot of people are surprised to find that there's a federally recognized Indian tribe in Alabama. So we faced the challenge, really, of how to reach both of these audiences and tell an authentic story that would resonate with the tribe who lived through their history, but also provide sufficient content and context that outside visitors can connect on a personal level. In conceptual discussions, early discussions, heard from the tribe really how important it was for them to be able to tell their story. Now, they had hired me and the firm that I work with to help tell their story, but they wanted to make sure that it was theirs and that it wasn't somebody else telling it. I think there's a lot of frustration among tribal groups with the way historically that museums and academics and historians have told their stories. There's a lot of cultural background to it. And that quotation here from Amber Alvarez, who was one of the people I worked with most closely, I just thought was so true. Historians, they only know what the facts tell them. So we wanted to make sure that we were letting the people who've lived the history interpret their traditional stories and their material culture. So our approach involved really incorporating a lot of real stories and real voices, but we knew that we were going to run into the issue of how can an individual speak for the whole community? If people are expected both to represent sort of a larger tribal context and tribal experience instead of sharing their own personal experience, sometimes people are reticent to take on that role. They don't want to have to be the token Indian that says, yes, this is what the entire tribe believes. And then there's the other question, how do you know that all of these real stories, these personal stories, are true and correct in a historical context? So we made the decision to add some contextualizing information on top of the first-person accounts, and then also add sort of a museum voice as well. So to give you some examples of this, the first-person recollections, this is an example from the former tribal chair, Buford Rowland. A lot of them, we didn't really edit these at all. These were quotations that came directly from people. They were, by and large, very emotional. And we wanted to preserve, sort of the dialect and the way people spoke. The second layer was kind of a shared, was really the museum voice. It was a Porch Creek point of view, but it was a little more universal rather than telling a personal experience. You can see we used we as our first person plural voice here, so that the content, again, was being told from the tribe's point of view. And while that's not appropriate for every exhibition, in this case, it really worked for the Porch Creek. Part of their culture, it has a really strong tie to hospitality, community, togetherness. These were all sort of big themes that we were trying to communicate in the exhibition. And so using that we voice really invited tribal members to share their own history, and it also invited people from outside to come in and feel like they were part of this story as well. And then we did have this third person voice as well. that was used primarily for sort of chronological information and some contextual information. Again, this was all edited by the museum staff. All the staff are Porch Creek Indians. We also worked with the Tribal Cultural Authority as well, and they had the final say. So they rewrote a lot of these labels in little ways, again, just to make sure that it was their words throughout the entire exhibition. The process of the text writing pretty much began about a year or more before we started really writing anything, putting pen to paper at all. And it started with the process of building relationships. You know, the museum and the Cultural Authority Board put us in touch with a lot of people throughout the community. We wanted to get a diversity of voices. It was important to have, you know, younger and older members, and male and female, and people with a whole variety of experiences. And, you know, I want to stress here that when working with Native content, it's really important to make sure that you're creating these continuing experiences and these continuing relationships rather than just looking for a rubber stamp approval. We wanted to really give people in the community an opportunity to sort of shape the direction of the exhibition. However, I must say, we also, the museum was sort of the final arbiter. They were the final decision maker, and the Cultural Board, they were the final editors, as I said. So while we opened this up to the public, ultimately the final decision was held within the museum. One of the ways that we were able to get so many people in the community to participate was that we tried to go where they were, rather than expecting them to come to the museum, although we certainly had some meetings there as well. But for instance, a member of my team went to a homecoming powwow. This was in Thanksgiving one year, and we set up a little stand in an old schoolhouse that the tribe owns. The tribe had posted on the walls all these photographs. It was kind of like a family album, as they called it. And we showed up, and we had some poster board with some lists of questions and some early renderings of what the exhibit might look like. And people would come in and they'd look at these photographs and they'd share stories about people that they saw and recognized. And we were frantically taking notes and recording everything that we heard so that we could really reflect the community voice in there. We did want to hear from elders and youth. So we went to a luncheon. The tribe sponsors a lunch for older members of the community. And so we went and we sat and we just ate with them and we had conversations. And it was really an informal, rather than having a meeting where we were standing up at the front of the room and asking people to talk to us. We were sitting there at a table with them, eating food and having these amazing conversations. And it was a chance to hear people really talk about their history in their own words. They used wonderfully place-specific and people-specific words came out. This one about fried chicken in the wash pot was in regards to some community fundraising dinners that happened in the early 60s to send the tribal chief to Washington, D.C. to meet with John F. Kennedy. And we kept hearing fried chicken in the wash pot. That was the only vessel that was large enough for the tribe to be able to cook the amount of chicken that they wanted to. And that made it into the final exhibition because it was so particular to their history. We met with a group of youth leaders as well, and these young men and women had really grown up in a Porch Creek that had always been federally recognized, had always had a powwow. So to them, what was really important to express was the idea of misconceptions, stereotypes about Indians, and they wanted to make sure that people knew that the tribe was a modern tribe, that throughout their whole history, things had changed and grown, and that it wasn't just a moment in time that, you know, this is the Indian time and that it stops. They wanted to truly express that it's modern. So we made sure, even as we were exploring historical content, to bring that modern voice throughout. This is a panel that we wrote specifically to address misconceptions. And you can see there were some little asides in parentheses that came directly from the youth voices there. It gave them an opportunity to feel as if they were speaking to people who were coming into the museum. The last thing that we heard that was really important was the use of the Creek language, of Muskogee language. it was one of the ways that the tribe has started reconnecting with their cultural heritage was using, was relearning the language. They've sort of called themselves the Forgotten Tribe. Since the 70s, they've been working with Muskogee Creek in in Oklahoma to relearn their language. And the youngest generation that's growing up now are really sort of the first fluent generation in probably a century. So they wanted to make sure that we were using we were using Creek words in the text and some Creek stories as well to sort of help educate the tribe, even as we were also educating outside visitors. So this is an introductory panel that we wrote for the exhibit, and you can see it uses a whole variety of Muskogee words. As a side, these were also spoken. There was a nearby interactive where visitors could hear this being spoken as well, so that it was sort of being reinforced throughout. I also want to point out, you can see that we were talking in the present tense when we introduced the panel, even though we were introducing historical content. We started in the present and we sort of end the panel in the present as well. The results of this have been really interesting. There were not any official, any formal evaluation work done, but the curator and other museum staff have told us that tribal members are really proud. They love to come in when they see their family's names. They want to take a photo of the panel that mentions it. They want to take a picture of their photograph where their family members are there. And there's a lot of pride. We've really started to use this museum as a place where community can come together. But they've also seen a lot of outside visitors really enjoying these personal connections and hungry for more personal connections. The curator told me that a lot of visitors are coming through and they want to sit down with Joseph afterwards and talk to them and hear more personal stories. So the museum is looking right now at doing an expansion of the exhibit, and they're looking to give some more space to those sorts of personal stories throughout. So I think we'll see this exhibit continue to evolve and grow as they include even more personal voices that help people to really connect. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I appreciate hearing your perspective and the work you're doing. Benjamin and Jenny Sayer and James, any thoughts or commentary about what Sarah's just presented for us?
This is Jenny Sayer, and I have to say I'm incredibly struck by the amount of time, the dedication that this process took to start a year out before writing, to be working with the community group. And I think that there might be some other people who want to speak to the complexity of the community involvement process, but I think that the result is clearly, seems to be really rewarding, but understanding the kind of commitment that it takes. This isn't something that you can say, gee, let's include the community's voices, we'll figure it out next week, but you really need to build it into a long-term schedule for your project.
Definitely, and for us, it was part of the design process as well. So we started with the community meetings when we were early in our schematic conceptual design. So the content was developing sort of in tandem with the design, and all of that was part of that community process. But definitely, it is something that I think museums need, if they're going to participate in, they need to commit to it and have it be a fairly transparent process. I think it would have been a very different exhibit if we had just shown up once and presented something and not given people a chance to weigh in, or if we had invited people to be a part of discussions and then they had seen no results. I think if people are invited to the table, they want to see that what they're saying, what they're contributing has an effect on the exhibit.
Which brings up the fascinating question of balancing that out with the overall story.
Definitely, and we were lucky to be working, directly with tribal members who were museum staff, and I think they really helped us, one, to navigate, who to talk with, who to bring to the table, and, who might be a good resource for talking about education in the tribe, who might be a good resource to talk about federal recognition. And so they were incredibly helpful. It would have been a much more difficult process if we had to find those people on our own. And then again, having them as sort of the final decision makers to say, yes, we think this accurately tells our story, or no, we think we need to tweak this a little and maybe rewrite this ourselves, was tremendously helpful.
Yes, this is Benjamin. I like how your process and the way you talk about it, you acknowledge that you want community members not just to rubber stamp something, but you also make clear that to say we want the community to speak here does not simply mean handing off the job of exhibit development or, in this case, label writing. That actually you were pretty clear here, and I assume with the community partners also, about the role that museum staff and you and your firm had as people playing a role in interpretation and in writing. And I think that kind of clarity is essential. One thing that didn't come up that I think also often you run into one runs into in these kinds of community projects is the fact that community is usually not singular. There are multiple voices, or often conflicts within a community, and so one can make an awful lot of effort to try to reflect the viewpoint of a committee that one has assembled, and then find out that that is a very narrow slice of a broader set of community voices. So I think that often one finds that there's a need for representing multiple voices, or purposely finding voices that are in conflict, and using juxtaposition, open questions to show that point out these differences. It can get challenging in that way too.
Yeah, I see one of the questions was about, whether we focus primarily on recognized leaders in the community, or if we reached out to there might be more diverse community members as well. We were working with the tribal council a bit, and the advisor board, the cultural advisor board, is made up of sort of tribal leaders. So they were helping us to guide who we were going to be speaking with. But one of the reasons we wanted to do some open meetings as well, the one at Powwow, for instance, was so we could hear from other people who had other opinions. And I think we were fortunate in the fact that the Porch Creek, there aren't a lot of political issues within the tribe. I know that can be a real factor, Benjamin. You're absolutely right that it can be a real factor within tribal leaders to, who do you talk with? If you talk to this person, is that person going to get insulted? And fortunately, that was not particularly an issue for us because it's a fairly small and tight-knit tribe. But I certainly think it would be an issue for other Native groups.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah. And I know that there's a few questions that have come in for you specifically in the chat box, and I think everyone would appreciate your responses there. But we're going to move on to our next presentation. And of course, everybody keep your questions and comments coming into the chat box as we go into this presentation presented by Susan Day from Kuwait City. Susan, thanks for being with us today.
Assalamu alaikum from Kuwait, y'all. I got to push the button. There we go. This is an exhibition that was very specially curated. I'm going to be talking about the labels for, definitely community-based. This object is a 12th or 13th century footwear foot scraper from the Eastern Iranian world. And that's about what you would normally know. And you do a quick look at the label. Oh, sorry. It's not working. This is the label that people see when they come to this exhibition. And what usually happens is they look at the object, have a quick glance at the label, and then they see that somebody has said it looks like an alien. And in that process, they have to then go back and look at the object again to see if they can find the alien or the hedgehog in this case. I'm with the Dar Athar al-Islamiyya, which is a nonprofit cultural organization in Kuwait that is based on objects from the Al-Sabah collection, largely art from the Islamic world, but recently Sheikh Nasser and Sheikh Hassa have gotten into pre-Islamic Southern Arabian, so we have quite an extensive collection of that now. And the pair took quite a leap of faith when they opened up the collection to a group of 6 to 12-year-olds, chief curators being the children in our children's art workshop, and assistant curators coming from 10 schools, public and private, and including 2 special needs schools in Kuwait. And the purpose was, we had been talking about how do we get children more engaged. And then we thought, well, maybe we need to ask the children how they could be more engaged. And then we thought, rather than asking them how, we just would ask them if they were interested in doing an exhibition. And quite happily for us, they said they were. Our kids, the Children's Art Workshop kids, worked from the objects in the collection office. I have to point out, we have great owners and a great curator and conservation team, because I know a lot of people wouldn't have this opportunity. But our kids actually worked out of the collection office. The schools were given packets, and you can see these pictures of objects. They were given packets of 10 and asked to pick 6. And the 6 were all then brought back together, and our kids made the final selections for the exhibition. But everybody, whether they were our kids or in a classroom, was asked to answer these 5 questions. Because it isn't enough to let the kids pick out the object. You want to understand why the kids. You want to pick them and let them explain what it was that they responded to. And it's kind of off topic, but the kids really put a lot of thought into it. And I thought they would pick all the bright, pretty, shiny things, and they didn't. As you can see from the broken plate in the upper right-hand corner. So they really did put a lot of thought into it, and some of the answers were actually quite detailed. And these were incorporated into the labels with the information about the origin and the date and things like that. So, for example, on this one, which is a 12th century or early 13th century dish, you have the kids pointing out that, which I think is funny and only in this region, because keep in mind there's 6 to 8, or 6 to 12 rather, that the part of the object is Tiffany blue. And I don't think a 6 to 8-year-old or a 6 to 12-year-old in Virginia, where I'm from, is going to come up with that. But also, they say that the camel is angry. So as people are looking at this, they're reading that description, and they're going to read the labels because they know the kids wrote them and think it's going to be cute. They then go back and look again at the object. So what we're finding is it's great for kids, but it's also attracting. It's also attractive to the adults. This is another example, and part of what the kids learned through this process was about art. We have a very transient or large expat community here, and clearly one of the schools that we dealt with had some kids from Australia. So the comment on this was that it had an Aboriginal feel to it. The kids in the Children's Art Workshop were not familiar with the phrase, so we explained it to them and pulled up other examples of Aboriginal art and asked the kids to look back and forth and see how they were the same and how they were different. And what was funny is at the opening, when the kids were all talking about specific objects to the visitors, the Minister of Information who did the opening came to this dish, and the girl who was in charge pointed out to him that while it might look Aboriginal from Australia, it was actually from Iran, and that's completely different. So they had remembered something that we had talked about, weeks, possibly even a month ago. We knew in the process of doing this, and it was part of the reason for the choice, for choosing to go ahead with it, was that we would get increased participation from schools. We got more visits from schools that were already coming, and we got new schools participating, particularly from the schools where the classrooms were contributors. It brought a lot more awareness to the organization and to our actual education programs. And in Kuwait, and as in most of this region, family doesn't mean mom, dad, brother, and sister. It's the grandparents and the aunts and the uncles and the nieces and the nephews. And they all attended, and what we found was a lot of cousins started signing up for our children's program and for programming in the gallery. Speaking of in the gallery, we did raise the floor about 20 centimeters. So now it becomes an exhibition that's great for working with our 18-month to 3-year-olds and also our 3 to 5-year-olds because they can actually see everything. And it had an impact on the soft skills and tangible knowledge in the chief curators as they had to work. There was a lot of compromise. Not everybody's objects could be chosen. There could only be one wall color, and it's bright blue. And so the kids had to learn how to compromise. They had to do critical thinking in how they were going to present these because they really and truly did everything. From from picking the objects to picking the logo, designing the look, and installing the objects. Now, some they weren't allowed to touch depending on how fragile they were, but they were actively involved in the installation. What was really interesting were the unintended consequences. The museum interns, we have an intern program for high school kids, they were disappointed because they have to, at the end of their 2 years, they have to create an exhibition and they don't get to use objects from the collection. And that was a bit disappointing for them, but I don't always have secure space. So it has to be something that can be broken or stolen. We also had an increase in interest in doing internships from university education and art history programs, and that was a benefit. But I've lost a paragraph there. The big unintended consequence, the biggest unintended consequences we saw though was in the adults. The adults, and this is only anecdotal and talking to people after we didn't have a formal study or anything, but adults spent a lot more time in this exhibition than we had anticipated, and they spent more time with individual cases and objects than we had anticipated, because they were doing these multiple, read the label, look at what they were seeing, read the label again, look at what they were seeing. And it actually turned out to be a lovely one. And I know that somebody before said something about not having to bend over. They did have to bend over to see this because we'd raise the floor, but we had magnifying glasses attached to every case because we wanted to be able to see the detail. So they were using the magnifying glass on the labels to read it a little bit, not having to bend over quite so far. And I think the conclusion for us was, as educators, we talk a lot about looking at things from a different perspective. This exhibition looks at things from a different perspective because it looks from the perspective of 6 to 12-year-olds. And in changing the perspective, it was more interesting for the target audience, which was children, but it was also significantly more interesting for the adults. And I think that was what was very exciting to us, the fact that we made them look again and again and again. Thank you. Shukran.
Thank you very much, Susan. As a former arts educator working with children, I really love this notion, and I really am very excited about what you've done. A couple of questions came in specifically for you, and one of them had to do with the accuracy of the children's commentary, their labels. How did you negotiate factual accuracy in the labels? For example, the response about the camel looking angry. Was in fact the camel angry?
Well, we don't know. So the factual information, the only factual information is the information that we got from the curating and conservation team, which is the production date, the material, the size, and things like that. The questions were purposefully subjective. We don't know if the camel was angry or not. Personally, I don't think he looks angry, but I do think the bird on the screen right now looks like he is very happy, and that his feathers are being blown in the wind. So unless it was completely ludicrous, and I have to say, out of 284 objects, not all of which wound up in the exhibition, I think there was only 2 or 3 that we had to completely disregard because they were not relevant, or you couldn't justify it in looking at the image. Actually, I saw somebody ask, I'm from Virginia, but I live in Kuwait now, and the kids are in Kuwait.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. James, Benjamin, Jenny Sayer, any thoughts you have about what Susan's presented in this really interesting exhibition process?
I have to confess, I've been so carefully monitoring the chat box that I probably missed some valuable information that Susan shared.
You can watch it on the replay.
This is Benjamin. I like your core point that this was a great experience for children, but that it offered something great for your adult visitors too. And I think that's something that in a way is not a surprise, because if one of our goals in the Good Label, I would say, is to offer visitors a way of seeing, a way of a strategy for looking at the object or the piece or whatever it is that the label is trying to point them to. Sometimes one way to do that is to give a very concrete and first-person, personal take on the object, so they have something to respond to, as opposed to giving a 20-point plan that an art historian might take. You're giving a very direct viewpoint, and that the visitor can then follow or go in their own direction, make their own conclusions. So that's one of the, as you say, one of the side benefits of offering the viewpoint of children.
This is Jenny Thayer, and just jumping on that, I agree, and it seems like they did such a nice job encouraging and sort of modeling observation, and you built that into your program process by asking the kids to really had great questions for them about the objects, and that really came across in the final labels as well, in the pieces that you pulled out of their observations that really seemed to invite and give the viewers, invite them in and give them permission to have some of their own thoughts and their own observations, and to sort of break that maybe that wall of feeling like someone is going to tell me what this is, so it doesn't matter what I think.
Thanks, Jenny.
Well, we also have a Post-it board with a question that changes every 2 weeks related somehow to the exhibition, that children and adults can, write the note on the Post-it and put it up. And again, the adults were adding their comments to that. So it was really interesting, or it is really interesting. It's still up.
Susan, what kind of introductory panel did you have for this exhibition, letting the audience know that what they were actually looking at in terms of the labels?
We had two different things. We had one that was kind of an archival piece that charted the process, explained exactly what the kids had to do to get from, yes, they voted they wanted to do an exhibition, to October it opens. We also had a panel that was written by one of the kid who gave the speech at the opening ceremony, and explaining from their perspective why they did it, what they got out of it, what made them tick, why they made the decisions that they made. And those are both actually outside, because the interior space is not tight, but to have big panels inside would have been too much. So it's just outside before you enter. And again, we do see people stopping to read it and to explain it, or so that they understand before they go in.
Interesting. And you articulated both intended and unintended consequences or outcomes. Did you do any kind of evaluation to determine if this exhibit model was a success?
Officially or professionally, or whatever word you want to use, no. What we did do is we just talked to a lot of people, and we looked at the numbers. I saw somebody ask, this is not the only exhibition. We have multiple exhibitions on all the time. So we have some pre-Islamic, we have other Islamic, and then we have a couple of different multimedia things. So we were talking to people as they came. We had more drop-ins. We had about a 60% increase in Family Day participation, which is a monthly family thing everybody's doing, you know what I mean? But we had a big increase in that. And then where the biggest increase was in the school, the classroom visits in elementary. And exciting for us, early elementary. We started getting a lot more like preschool, kindergarten, first and second grade. And that's really cool, because if we can get them excited at their age, they'll keep coming back. So probably an unintended consequence I should have mentioned. But only in just looking at increases in the numbers and anecdotal evidence do we know it's been a success.
Interesting. Here's a question that came in about the labels themselves. Were the children's labels from individuals, or were they composites?
The ones for the objects that were selected directly by our kids were individuals. The ones that were selected by the classroom, some of those were individual, and some of those were, we would have like 3 or 4 responses to each question about the same object. But then the kids, and again, I really want to stress, this was in fact the kids. It's not me saying it was the kids. The kids would look at, and there was the picture of the kids sprawled out with stuff on the floor. That's what they were doing, is they were reading and picking the pieces that they found interesting. So if you go back and look, for example, at the alien, the one we were talking about first, one kid wrote that it was an alien, and the other said, no, no, no. They knew it was a hedgehog. So they combined information where they could. And to be fair, and to be honest, that part of the job was really more the 10 to 12-year-olds than it was the 6 to 8-year-olds. So there was some, age-appropriate stuff in there.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, thank you very much, Susan. And of course, there's a handful of questions that are coming in. So thank you for taking a few moments to respond in the chat box as we move on to our last presentation from Kat Talley-Jones on telling LA's wildest story. I'll turn it over to you, Kat.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you everybody for sticking with this. I know it's been some time, and I want my lunch. You people on the East Coast have had yours, but I haven't yet. So I'm talking about the Nature Lab at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. This is a permanent exhibit that opened in the summer of 2013. The museum had done a lot of focus groups, really had kind of a clear picture of who their visitors are, mirroring the demographics of Los Angeles pretty much, for educational level, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. So we had a pretty good picture of who the visitors were. We did some formative evaluation beforehand about what they knew about nature in LA, and they didn't think there was much. So one of our goals with the Nature Lab was to surprise people with how exuberant and diverse nature is in Los Angeles. And we wanted to encourage them to get out and explore nature and participate in making discoveries as citizen scientists. We know that people visit the museum in multi-generational family groups. So we're really looking at tech strategies and exhibit strategies that captured families, and we wanted to avoid jargon. We knew that they loved science, loved the idea of nature, didn't actually know that much about it. So we stayed away from terms like biodiversity. We tackled the concept, but we seldom used the scientists' terms of art. But we also worked hard to make the text accurate, and so that it would pass muster with our scientists and subject matter experts. And this took a lot of negotiation and many iterations. Things got revised and revised and revised. We aimed for text at about a 6th grade reading level, which I know is much lower than the Art Museum folks, and we mostly succeeded. It was hard to do, though. The Nature Lab is a little bit unusual in that all the exhibit elements are integrated. And so the graphics and the text and the specimens and the live animals, they all work together. So we developed the exhibit text hand in hand with all the other disciplines that were involved. So with the designers, with the live animal keepers, with the scientists who were choosing the specimens that were on display. We often had text before we had graphics, which I find a little bit unusual in projects I've worked on. This also led to many iterations as we developed the exhibit and as it was produced and installed. The Nature Lab has 6 entrances. So it wasn't possible to develop a linear narrative. That just couldn't work. We knew that people were going to be moving around in there like balls in a pachinko machine or pinball machine, and we didn't even attempt to make it a narrative of any kind. Kim Bear and Associates, the exhibit's designers, developed a graphic hierarchy that we stuck to. It gave visitors a sense that they always knew how to find out how they could interact and explore in a space where there was a lot going on. One key was, I'm sure you all know the exhibit typology of streakers, strollers, and studiers, and we figured we would have a lot of streakers, that there would be parents chasing toddlers. So we tried to capture people's attention with very catchy headings and subtitles that work together. So a certain amount of alliteration, puns, things that make you look, you don't think about turtles being renegades that much. We kept the word count very short, from 30 to 50 words. When I hear you folks talk about 100 words, I think, oh my God, I wouldn't know what to do with 100 words. And we kept it to one idea. And that could be hard sometimes. Then these were sometimes complemented with factoids that were funny, or they were superlatives, or inside information that our scientists had. And we layered content, so the studiers and the geeks had a place to satisfy their curiosity, and I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. From our visitor studies, we knew that people were interested in the charismatic megafauna, and we knew that the mountain lions had to be one of our heroes. So we started out with kind of a conventional label about the problems the mountain lions have. And I don't want to keep this up here too long, but we tested this with visitors, and they thought it was boring. What we had to do here in our new label was I call it drowning kittens. We had to kill some darlings. Even if I loved that mountain lions were big carnivores that were discovered in the tar pits from 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years ago, and they still live in Los Angeles, we just had to let that go, and it broke my heart. But we went back to our idea that we were looking at real nature in real time. So we had a scenario. It's 2:46 a.m. This is super Hollywood kind of approach. A young mountain lion runs across the 101 freeway. And so we set it as a moment in time, and the mountain lion is a character facing a hazard, and people care about the mountain lion. We looked to do this in other ways. We looked for relatable stories based on real people. So here we have a boy named Reese, who was just a completely passionate about lizards. And he found a lizard that had been introduced into Los Angeles, and he was the first person who found this lizard. So we have a text that talks about the moment that he finds the lizard, and I was able to talk to him, and he said, oh, well, I've already caught a bazillion lizards. And he knew this one was special. So we were able to capture his voice here. And it was a great way to get across the idea that there are species that come into Los Angeles that get here when we don't intend for them to get here. Then this is the secondary text that went alongside of it that also is working in an approachable tone. We're addressing the visitors directly, and it goes into a little more depth. And then side by side with that, we have, this is for the studiers. It's got the scientific name of the gecko. It tells a little bit more about where they can be found, some cool facts. And this, Shirley talked about placement. Sadly, this got placed usually in some knee-level spot where us tall adults can't see it. So I think that was probably not our most successful
placement moment, but it's there for the people who want to know a little bit more about geckos. And we have this. It's almost, we were inspired by the tombstone labels that art museum people have in putting these together. So another strategy that we used was illustrating our text. We were inspired by graphic novels, which a lot of the visitors to the museum read, and which a lot of the staff members read. And we worked this, I drafted base text. We would run it by the subject matter experts, and then the illustrators would adapt it, often adding their own quirky voices to it. So this was done by Wendy McNaughton. You may know, who I think wrote a book called Lost Cat, tracking, she and her wife lost their cat, and then when it came back, they put a radio collar to see what it did. So she had a really cool perspective on urban animals. And these are very successful with the multi-generational groups. People read them to each other and have a lot of fun with them. We also used first-person stories about encounters in LA, and these we integrated with taxidermy specimens, and there are little videos and interactives and places where people can draw and write their own stories. And these are all first-person from the point of view of people in everyday situations. They're not scientists in the field, and it shows visitors they can connect with people who observe nature, that they could do it, and that they were invited to do it, and that we wanted to know about what they saw. So we did a summative evaluation. 99% of the visitors rated the Nature Lab highly, so that it was hands-on, good for kids, not just good for kids. I like it too. Half said they learned there was more nature in LA than they had realized. They had no idea there's so many different animals out there. And about 40% said they were excited about doing citizen science projects. And we were very thrilled to get kind praise from a New York Times writer, which is unusual for things in Los Angeles. So Edward Rothstein said, "The lab's exhibits are among the most successful I have seen for children in a science museum. The old museum genre has been turned on its head. This is not a narrative of an all-seeing culture evolving out of the wilds of nature, but of a culture tentatively trying to find its way into nature." And thank you for your time with the lizards.
Great, thanks very much, Kat. And while you were talking, there was a number of comments, and especially Sarah, I appreciate your comment about how this is a really well-integrated exhibit process, text and graphics really working together. I wanted to know, Sarah, if you had anything you wanted to add to your comment.
Well, that was a kind of in response to some questions about sort of, who goes first? Is it text or is it graphic design? And, sort of thinking about sort of who drives that design. And in my experience, the best exhibits are the ones where it really is kind of seamless and you can't tell, oh yeah, the text writer wrote this and then insisted to the graphic designer, this is how it's going to be, or vice versa. And, just seeing the pictures of Kat's exhibition and hearing her talk about it, it really does seem like it was completely collaborative all the way through. And I think it definitely shows in the finished exhibition what an interplay there must have been between graphic design and exhibition design and text writing. There really was, and some of it was that kind of 2 a.m., oh my God, can you eliminate 4 words from this panel because it's going, the kerning isn't right, or, the line break is terrible. But it was a great graphic relationship, a great relationship with everybody. And I see some questions that say that sometimes the text is there first, and I think sometimes that's true with scripts, but as a freelancer, it's not unusual for me to come in about a month before an exhibit opens and people go, oh, crap, we forgot. There have to be labels. I'm just shocked sometimes at how often this happens. Can you write about Richard Nixon's foreign policy? And you have 3 days to do it. So to have it at this
point was really a luxury, and it was terrific.
So, Kat, we did a very quick on-the-fly poll to find out about the process when writing labels. Do you develop graphics before text, text before graphics, or a combination of the two? So everybody can see the results.
Well, look at that.
Any comments from our panelists?
This is Jenny Sayre. I think what's so interesting, what I feel like I've seen over the last number of years, and there has been a practice of sort of throwing it over the wall between the content, the curators, or the writers, and design. And I feel like the field has really tried to push in the direction of a stronger relationship. And there are a number of these examples we've heard about today that show what can happen when there is a stronger relationship between the design approach and the interpretive approach. If you have a larger idea of a point or a voice, a tone you're trying to get across, as I think is clearly demonstrated in this example, how you want people to feel that informal engagement and engaging people to putting text where you want them to stoop down next to the animal, or the informal style of I was thinking of the graphic novel style. That's a really different experience than walking in and seeing like the text was supplied at a later time and placed next to things. It's exciting to see it.
This is Benjamin. I think your story here is a great example of the discipline involved, the discipline it takes to be playful, and that you were slicing away at these labels, trying to make them shorter and shorter, and yet that's what you needed to do in order for them to have a kind of freshness that they wouldn't have had if you hadn't taken such a disciplined approach to it. I think it's kind of a irony in that you wanted to look like they were tossed off, to read as if they were tossed off, but that requires an awful lot of work. And then the other thing that relates to that is something you said at the beginning, that you had very big and concrete interpretive concepts to get across, but you managed to do that in a very playful way, partly by resisting the instinct to name all those concepts for yourself. You talked about biodiversity without naming biodiversity. You talked about natural competition and evolution and all of that through a really compact story. So I think it's a good model in that way.
I did sneak one biodiversity in. It's kind of an Easter egg in a mural. So a herpetologist and I was like, we have to get it in here somewhere. So, but it would be difficult for anybody to find.
Great. Thanks very much, Kat. And this is the part of our program as we wind down to the last handful of minutes, where really all of our colleagues, Shirley, Sarah, Benjamin, Susan, Jenny Sayre, Kat, and James are all here to have a conversation. And so I invite each of you to start a conversation about what you might have taken away from the 4 presentations you've seen.
This is Sarah. I'll take a stab. One thing that I've been really struck by when I've seen the winners from CurCom's label writing exhibition, and certainly the 3 other examples today, it's just people who are taking risks. I get really energized by seeing people who are doing something different. And as we've seen, some of the responses aren't always great. I think anytime we're sort of changing approaches, there are some visitors who are going to say, I don't like this, this is different, this isn't what I expected. But I really love, personally, I think it helps me grow as an interpretive writer and developer, and it helps me to kind of think outside the box a little more, to use a terrible writing cliche. But I find it really inspirational to see some of the experimentation, really thoughtful experimentation and risk that's happening with this whole variety of projects.
This is Benjamin. I would just say that these are unusual examples that we've seen here, and I agree with Sarah. That's part of what makes them exciting. When we were doing the judging for the label writing competition, too, we were, as you say, we were often struck by sort of startling, surprising departures. But at the same time, I think if every museum, every exhibit has to confront a lot of the same, or work with a lot of the same tools that these examples are. You know, whether you are, even if you're not going to use the voice of 8-year-olds in your exhibit, you do need to make a decision about voice. You know, it's not making a decision. If you think you're not making a decision, you still have a voice in your labels. And so to be conscious about what voice are you using, likewise, what language are you using, what tone, and you know, again, even if you're not comfortable using a graphic novel style in your labels, there's still, you need to think about what is the graphic approach that you are taking. So I think these examples, even if you're working in a museum where you aren't in a position, or you're not sure if you're in a position to do something wildly experimental, I think the elements that they're working with here can lead to better and more interesting work, even within more traditional formats or on more traditional topics, perhaps.
And just a quick point about, it's Shirley here picking up on voice. I think of all of the exhibitions that I work on, each of them seems to have a different personality. And so the tone and the voice that we use in different exhibitions, it does change. We do try to maintain that informal conversational tone, but there is the odd exhibition that actually calls for a slightly more formal tone. It's just the character of the works and of the ideas that we're trying to share and connect with our visitors. So the way we're trying to connect with our visitors. So, you know, it's kind of like create the guidelines and then break them. But, you know, I do feel like different exhibitions and different objects have different personalities.
It is. I just want to follow up on what you said, Benjamin. I think that was terrific to point back to the questions that need to be answered for every project about your voice and your tone and your approach. How is it that you want to communicate with people? And that labels then are one of the pieces of that interpretation. And how do they work with all the rest of your interpretation? They want to have a convivial relationship with them, so that it's all of one piece.
This is Kat, and one thing I do as a freelancer is I will often generate tone samples before I start writing the labels. So I might take a formal approach, one that's less formal, one that draws on quotes, so the client can say, oh, yeah, okay, we want to go this direction. And that can be really helpful, and I think even in-house that can be something that is useful to do.
Yeah, we've done that too. That's a great practice to promote.
I think it was Judy Rand, who I name-checked in the chat a while back, but talked about finding sort of the perfect person to walk you through an exhibition. I think somebody had mentioned that earlier in the presentation, but that's what always helps me to figure out the tone. You know, sometimes, and Kat, I'm in the same situation as you as a contractor, meeting that person who's so passionate about their content, or, you know, finding that voice that really seems to be the most appropriate. And obviously we want to make sure that, you know, in the exhibitions it's not mimicry, but I think giving some thought to how best to express the content is a really important thing, and I think we're hearing a lot about today.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for sharing your time and your expertise and your your inspiration, really. It's all of these projects are quite wonderful, and I appreciate that very much. I do want to remind everybody in the audience, if you would please, to take a moment to provide us your anonymous feedback in the evaluation link at the top left-hand corner of your screen. And a very big shout out to my colleagues from the Curators Committee, in particular James Burns and also Ellen Inslow. I know you're out in the audience. And our colleagues from NAME and EdCom. All three of these are professional networks of AAM and are obviously involved in the exhibition label writing competition. So thank you all for sharing of your time and being with us today. And for you in the audience, thank you so much for being such a great and active audience and sharing your perspective and asking great questions. I know that we will be continuing the theme of this webinar in future programs, so keep your eyes and ears open. Should also let you know, for those of you who are registered for this program, the recording will be made available to you in a couple of days, so look for an email from us, and we'll capture the chat transcripts and see about making those available as well, since they were so lively and so useful. With that said, I'll go ahead and sign off, and thank you all very much for joining us.